Hi everyone, it's Mike LaChance. You may know my work from the Legal Insurrection blog and a few other sites. I decided I wanted to start making some videos, especially now that we're getting closer to the 2020 election. And I wanted to start out by talking about something that I think is a very important issue. I think that the Democrats, Joe Biden in particular, may be having some trouble with black voters. And this is an extremely important aspect of the election. Before I go to this article, let me just give it a little background. You may remember back in 2008, a lot of pundits talked about something called the Obama coalition. This was the coalition of voters that sent Obama to the White House in 2008 and again in 2012. And it was made up of a massive upswell in voters from the black community, as well as white liberals, Latino liberals, and even some conservatives. And I think that the Democrats were kind of hoping, maybe not counting on, but definitely hoping, that the Obama coalition would show up to vote for Joe Biden in 2020. That may even be part of the reason why he got the nomination, because if you remember, when Biden finally got his primary victory in South Carolina, driven largely by Representative Clyburn, Democrats in the media really hyped the fact that black voters really came out strongly for Biden. And this was part of a strategy. And the strategy was related to this Obama coalition that again, they were hoping would show up for show up for Biden the way that they did for Obama. And it's why overnight you saw virtually every other candidate running for the Democratic nomination drop out, with the exception of Elizabeth Warren, because Warren wasn't taking voters away from Biden. She was taking voters away from Bernie Sanders, who was still in the race at that point. And Bernie stayed in at that point too, because Bernie has his own coalition. So Bernie wasn't really taking voters away from Biden either. But now we flash forward to the beginning of September. The election is, less than 3 months away. And we've got this article you can see I've got on the screen from The Hill. This is from Marty Johnson at The Hill. Biden steps up black voter outreach in battleground states. Let's read a little bit of this. Democratic presidential candidate nominee Joe Biden's campaign has in recent days increased outreach to black voters in battleground states expected to play a pivotal role in the outcome of November's election. The effort underscores the importance for Biden of energizing minority voters in the handful of swing states that will ultimately decide the race between him and President Trump. If we think about, this is a quote from the executive director of the left-leaning Black PAC. She says, quote, "If we think about the swing states where black voter turnout dropped off in 2016, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Biden needs black turnout to increase to back or near Obama levels." This is what she said. This is what she told The Hill. She goes on in a quote, "They certainly cannot be where they were in 2016. This is so much bigger than anyone in the media is willing to admit, certainly bigger than most Democrats are willing to admit. And I think it's also part of the reason why, if you go back to the beginning of the summer, the end of the spring, right around the time that George Floyd was killed, that event was the catalyst for the beginning of Black Lives Matter protests. And I'm not talking about riots, I'm talking about legitimate protests. That's when that began to start. But that was also the beginning of these far left riots, and there's really nothing you can call them other than that. And they've now become sort of intertwined, and it's very difficult to distinguish between the two because radicals from Antifa have sort of embedded themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the two have they've become intertwined. And this is also a real problem for Democrats. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that it was right around this time, and this is, I think, purely a coincidence, although it's a coincidence and it isn't. It was right around this time that we began to see a couple of polls suggest that Trump had much more support from the black community than anybody thought he ever would. And now, just recently, we've seen a couple of polls again reaffirm this idea. Now, is President Trump going to run away with votes from the black community? It's hard to say at this point. And I'm not black and I can't speak for black voters. But just going by what I've read in polls, I think that President Trump has stronger support from the black community than anyone in the Democratic Party or in the liberal media is willing to admit. And I think that that's part of the reason why the far left is losing their minds and why the radical element of the far left has jumped onto the Black Lives Matter movement and made them sort of indistinguishable from legitimate protests at this point. It's all intertwined. But the point is that if they're counting on the Obama coalition to carry Joe Biden across the finish line, then we wouldn't be seeing headlines like this that say Biden is stepping up his outreach to the black voter community in battleground states. He would not need to do this. Anyone who remembers the 2008 election or even the 2012 election knows that Obama didn't even really need to do any sort of voter outreach. It was all organic and completely real. He didn't even have to try. And I just don't see this happening for Joe Biden. I don't see a tremendous amount of excitement. Again, when I'm looking at the polls, I just don't see it there for him. And this is going to play a huge role in November. And if Trump can take just a small portion of that voter bloc away from Joe Biden, he is going to have a serious problem. Now, on this same note, since we're talking about battleground states in this particular article from The Hill, I want to do one other thing as long as I'm here. I want to look at and I want to show you the Electoral College Map from 2016. This is the actual, I hope you can see the whole thing. This is the actual Electoral College Map from the 2016 election. And if you've been paying attention to politics, you probably already have seen this and you already know this. But let's play with the numbers just for a minute here, okay? Let's say that somehow Joe Biden knocks South Carolina out of play for Trump. Let's turn South Carolina blue. You can see that Trump is still well over 270. Okay? Let's do the same thing with Michigan, which has 16 Electoral College votes. Turn that blue. Trump is still over 270. Right? Now, let's take away Michigan from Trump and then take away Wisconsin from Trump. Trump is still over 270. You see how difficult this is going to be for Joe Biden to shift the Electoral College map in 2020. I mean, anybody who thinks that this is going to be easy is crazy. I think that Democrats and the media are way too overconfident about this, about what's going to happen. Now, let's go back to the original 2016 Electoral College map as it was. And now let's add Minnesota, which Trump could very well win. Okay? Then let's add New Hampshire, which Trump could very well win. In fact, let's even add all of Maine. Maine is one of those weird states that has like different districts that respond, can respond independently. So let's make that solid red. Okay? Now Trump's at 323 Electoral College votes, and the Democrat is at 215. Now, on top of that, let's think of something really sort of off the charts. I know some people have talked about a possible landslide for Trump. Let's not even go there. But let's say that Trump manages to flip a state that no one expected him to flip. Something that at this point doesn't even seem to be in play. Like, say, Colorado, which has 9 electoral college votes. Okay, now Trump is at 332, the Democrat is at 206. Okay, what if something really crazy happens, like Trump flips New York, which after the riots in Rochester, I think is completely possible. You take the riots in Rochester from this week on top of what has been happening in New York City since the beginning of the summer, and New York has 29 electoral college votes. Let's turn that red and see what happens. Now Trump is at 352, and Biden would be at under 200 at 186. And I mean, anything could happen. What if Trump managed to flip Virginia? I mean, Virginia has been a subject of controversy in the last 6 months because ever since the Democrats took over there, they have tried to enforce incredibly strict gun laws, and there's been a massive pushback from right-leaning people in Virginia. So what if Trump managed to flip Virginia? Now Trump's at 365, and Biden would be at 173. All these things are possible. This could all happen. All right, I'm just going to go back to where it was in 2016. My point is, anything could happen this fall. But I think that Trump is probably going to hold the Rust Belt. And as I pointed out a few minutes ago, he could lose Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Ohio, and he could still be over 270. And then he could pick up other states like Minnesota or Colorado or New Mexico. I don't know if he'd pick up anything on the West Coast, although I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, do you think that the entire state of Oregon is made up of Antifa? It's not. Portland is maybe left-leaning, but there are parts of Oregon that are very conservative. Lots of gun owners, lots of business owners. Same thing with Washington State. And it's not like this has never happened before. I mean, if anybody's old enough to remember the 1984 election, Reagan's second term, he won every single state except Minnesota. These things can happen. So I think that the Democrats and the media are whistling past the graveyard. I think this is an uphill battle for them. I don't think that Trump voters can take anything for granted. And I don't think that Trump is taking anything for granted. You can tell because even Trump is still campaigning and going to swing states, and he is fighting hard for states that he did not win in 2016, like Minnesota and New Hampshire. And he could very well win them in November 2020. So hang on to your hats, folks, because this ain't over yet. Not by a long shot.